The Roman Empire, at its peak, stretched from the lush fields of northern Britain to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the farthest reaches of Mesopotamia in the east. Its vastness was unmatched, its military might seemingly unstoppable. The legions, highly disciplined and fiercely loyal, were the backbone of this imperial machine. These soldiers were the ones who brought the Roman standard to the most remote corners of the known world. But despite all its grandeur, there were places in the empire's reach that even the Romans couldn't tame, lands so wild and untamed that even the greatest legions were vulnerable. The northern territories of Britain, filled with dense forests, steep hills, and unforgiving weather, were one such place. In the year 120 AD, Emperor Hadrian decided that the vast province of Britannia needed to be secured. The Picts, a fiercely independent group of tribes who lived in what is now Scotland, had been a constant thorn in the side of Roman rule. They had raided Roman settlements, killed soldiers, and thwarted the empire's expansion. Hadrian, a ruler known for his strategic foresight, ordered the construction of a massive wall, Hadrian's Wall, to fortify the Roman hold on the land. But even with this formidable structure, the Romans knew they could not simply contain the Picts. They needed to subdue them, to bring them under Roman control. Among the many legions stationed across the empire, one was assigned the task of dealing with the Pictish threat head-on. The 9 Hispana, a legion with a storied history, was chosen for the mission. Originally raised in Spain, the 9 Hispana had fought in many of Rome's most famous campaigns. Their reputation as tough, reliable soldiers had earned them the trust of the empire. They were stationed in the province of Britannia, preparing for the next phase of the Roman conquest, a march into the Scottish Highlands, a land few Romans had ever ventured into. The army, led by a Roman general whose name has been lost to history, began their journey north in the spring of 120 AD. The terrain was harsh. The dense forests made it difficult for the soldiers to move in formation. The rivers, swollen from the melting snow, cut off their paths. Yet, despite these challenges, the Roman legions pressed on. They were confident. After all, they had faced worse in the past: barbarian hordes, treacherous mountain passes, and vast deserts. The Picts, though fierce warriors, were no match for the might of Rome. Or so they thought. As they made their way deeper into the Scottish Highlands, the 9 Hispana began to face more than just the physical challenges of the land. The soldiers were unaccustomed to the cold, wet conditions. Their Roman armor, heavy and cumbersome, became a liability in the boggy, marsh-filled landscape. Rations began to run low. Even with their superior military organization, the Roman soldiers struggled. But still, they pressed forward, determined to bring an end to the Pictish threat once and for all. In the days that followed, the Romans found themselves increasingly isolated. The Picts, who had long been accustomed to the harsh conditions of the Scottish Highlands, used guerrilla tactics to great effect. They would strike quickly and retreat into the wilderness before the Romans had a chance to retaliate. The Roman soldiers, who had been used to fighting organized battles, were unprepared for this kind of warfare. They began to lose ground. The Picts attacked their supply lines, making it harder for the Romans to resupply. The legions, once confident in their superiority, now found themselves at the mercy of a relentless enemy who seemed to know the land better than they did. Despite the Romans' best efforts, their position grew more precarious with each passing day. The soldiers' morale began to falter. They had expected a quick victory, but instead, they found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition. Tensions between the soldiers and their commanders began to rise. Some began to question the wisdom of venturing so far north, while others started to wonder if the Picts were truly as easily defeated as the Romans had believed. And then, just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, something unprecedented happened. The Roman legion, once a proud force in the Roman military machine, simply disappeared. It wasn't a sudden disappearance, but rather a gradual one. The first signs were small: an abandoned camp, a missing officer, a broken supply chain. But as the days passed, these small signs grew into something much more ominous. The soldiers of the 9 Hispana, the very backbone of the Roman Empire's military, seemed to vanish without a trace. The first reports of the disappearance reached Roman officials in Britannia, but they did not immediately react. They believed it was just a minor setback, a temporary retreat. But as time went on, the situation became more concerning. The legion, which had been one of the most reliable in the empire, had simply disappeared. No battles had been fought. No traces of a great struggle had been found. The Roman military, which prided itself on its ability to control any situation, was left with a mystery that would haunt the empire for centuries. Historians, both ancient and modern, have speculated on what happened to the 9 Hispana. Some believe the legion was annihilated by the Picts in a series of brutal ambushes. Others suggest that the soldiers simply deserted, fleeing into the wilderness to escape the hardships they had faced. Some theories even propose that the legion was secretly relocated to another part of the empire, its disappearance covered up for political reasons. But despite these theories, the truth remains elusive. What is known for certain is that the 9 Hispana vanished from the historical record, and with them, so did the lives of thousands of Roman soldiers who had once been among the empire's finest. The loss of the 9 Hispana was a blow to the Roman Empire, both militarily and psychologically. For an empire built on the principle of Roman dominance, this was a sobering reminder that there were forces beyond its control. The disappearance of the legion was not just a military failure, it was a stark reminder that even the greatest empire in history was not invincible. The soldiers of the 9 Hispana had walked into the wilderness with confidence and ambition, but they never returned. Their fate remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of Rome. This mysterious disappearance left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the Roman world. For years, the story of the Lost Legion became a whispered legend among Roman soldiers, an eerie cautionary tale about the dangers of overextending the empire's reach. Even after the Roman Empire fell, the legend of the vanished army endured. It became a part of the broader mythos of Rome's decline, a reminder that even the mightiest empires have their limits, and sometimes, they are tested in ways no one could ever imagine. The story of the 9 Hispana, like so many other tales of ancient warfare, is a reminder of the fragility of power. The Roman Empire may have seemed invincible, but even it was vulnerable to the forces of nature, the unpredictability of battle, and the stubborn resistance of those who lived in the fringes of civilization. The Lost Legion is a story not just of military failure, but of human ambition, hubris, and the price of empire. As the Roman legions marched north, the air grew colder, the days shorter, and the land more hostile. It was a transition from the familiar fields of southern Britannia, with their rolling hills and settled farmsteads, to the untamed wilds of the Scottish Highlands. The thick forests gave way to fog-laden hills and deep, winding rivers, turning every step into an arduous journey. Even for the disciplined Roman soldiers, this was a foreign and unforgiving environment. The Roman legions were built for organized warfare, for conquering well-defended cities and holding strategic points. But they were not prepared for the guerrilla tactics of the Picts. These were people who knew the land like no one else, who could disappear into the forests and reappear where the Romans least expected it. The Picts were not a unified army but a confederation of fiercely independent tribes, each with its own leaders and tactics, but all bound by a shared hatred of Roman imperialism. They had learned to adapt to the harshness of their environment, becoming masters of the terrain that the Romans now sought to conquer. Roman commanders had underestimated their enemy. They believed that the legions, with their superior training and organization, would quickly crush the Picts and bring them under Roman rule. But as the days passed, the Romans began to realize just how wrong they had been. The dense forests made it nearly impossible for them to move quickly or communicate effectively. The terrain itself worked against them, with each river crossing and mountain pass becoming a new challenge. The Picts, meanwhile, struck swiftly and silently, ambushing Roman supply caravans and small groups of soldiers. The legions, heavily burdened by their armor and equipment, struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to the discipline and order of the legion, began to feel the weight of their isolation. They had expected a campaign like so many before it, a decisive battle, a quick victory, and then a return to their comfortable barracks. But instead, they found themselves in a war of attrition, facing an enemy they could not see and a land that seemed to conspire against them at every turn. The further the Romans marched, the more their supplies dwindled. The Picts were quick to raid their food stores, cutting off vital supply lines and forcing the Romans to rely on what little they could forage. The Roman diet, built around grains and wine, was not suited for the harsh conditions of the highlands, and soldiers began to suffer from hunger and exhaustion. The heavy Roman armor, once a symbol of their power and superiority, now became a burden. It was difficult to keep up with the relentless pace of the march, and the soldiers' bodies grew weary. As the Roman army advanced, they began to make mistakes. Their once efficient command structure began to falter. Communication broke down between the officers, and the soldiers started to question their leaders. Rumors spread that their generals were either too ambitious or too incompetent to lead them through the harsh terrain. The Roman sense of order, which had been their greatest strength, was starting to unravel. This sense of disarray was not only felt by the soldiers but also by the local Roman officials who were supposed to support the campaign. Some whispered that the generals were too eager to please the emperor, pushing their soldiers beyond their limits in the name of imperial glory. Others suspected that political ambitions within the Roman ranks were clouding the judgment of the commanders. As the days stretched into weeks, the once proud legions began to show signs of strain. The soldiers, once brimming with confidence, now began to doubt the wisdom of their mission. They had come to the highlands expecting to crush a small, fragmented enemy, but instead, they found themselves bogged down in a war they didn't understand. Their hopes of a quick victory faded as the Picts continued to harass them from the shadows, striking and retreating before the Romans could retaliate. It wasn't just the terrain and the Picts that caused the Roman soldiers to lose their will. The psychological toll was immense. The isolation, the constant pressure, the feeling of being hunted, it began to chip away at their morale. The soldiers had been trained for battle, but they were not prepared for the slow erosion of their spirits. As the Romans pressed on deeper into Pictish territory, the soldiers grew restless. There were whispers of mutiny, of soldiers wondering whether it was worth it to continue on this path. Some wondered if they would ever see their homes again. The commanders, too, were feeling the pressure. They were used to being in control, to having their every move supported by the full might of the Roman Empire. But here, in the wilds of the north, they felt as though they were losing their grip. The legions were not designed for this type of conflict, and the commanders were beginning to realize that they had made a grave mistake in venturing so far from their supply lines and reinforcements. Some of the generals began to argue over tactics, with some advocating for retreat, while others insisted on pushing forward, driven by the desire to complete the mission and prove their worth to the emperor. In the midst of all this turmoil, the Roman soldiers became more and more isolated from their commanders. The once clear lines of communication had become blurred, and the generals, trapped in their own hierarchy of orders and counter-orders, were unable to offer any meaningful direction. The soldiers, left to their own devices, began to lose their sense of unity. The legion was no longer a cohesive fighting force but a collection of weary, desperate men, struggling to survive. But it wasn't just the psychological toll that began to wear down the Romans, it was the physical strain. The march through the highlands was brutal. The soldiers were constantly battling the elements, rain, mud, and wind, that made even the simplest tasks difficult. The Roman road-building techniques, which had once allowed their legions to march with efficiency, were of little use in the rugged hills and deep marshes of the highlands. Every step felt like a struggle, and the soldiers began to question whether it was worth it. They had been trained for battle, not for this slow, grueling march through the wilderness. Yet despite all of this, the Romans continued to press on. There was a sense of determination among them, a belief that they could not turn back, that retreat would be seen as a failure by the empire. The desire to succeed, to return home with glory, kept them moving forward even as their bodies and minds began to break down. They had come this far and they could not afford to fail. But as the Roman legions ventured further into the highlands, the situation became even more dire. The Picts, who had been watching the Romans closely, began to step up their attacks. They targeted the weakest points in the Roman formations, picking off small groups of soldiers, and then disappearing into the wilderness. These attacks were not about winning battles but about breaking the spirit of the Romans. The Picts knew that they couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the Romans in open combat, but they could make life unbearable for the invaders. Every day, it seemed, brought a new challenge, a new ambush. The Romans could no longer rely on their superior numbers and tactics. Instead, they had to rely on their endurance and their will to survive. But with each passing day, that will began to wane. The longer the Roman army stayed in the highlands, the more it became clear that their mission was doomed. What had started as a campaign of conquest soon turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The Romans, once the conquerors, now found themselves on the defensive, surrounded by an enemy they could not see, fighting on terrain that worked against them at every turn. The fate of the 9 Hispana was already sealed. But none of the soldiers knew it yet. They continued to march north, unaware that they were walking into the unknown, into a future from which they would never return. As the Roman legions pressed deeper into the Scottish Highlands, the unrelenting march took a toll on the soldiers, both physically and mentally. What had started as a mission of imperial conquest had gradually become a desperate struggle for survival. The legions, once filled with confident soldiers, now looked weary, their bodies ravaged by exhaustion, hunger, and the harsh elements. They were a shadow of their former selves, and the Picts, once seen as a fragmented and easily defeated enemy, were beginning to reveal just how dangerous they could be. The Picts were not a conventional army in the way the Romans were accustomed to. They didn't have the large, organized formations, the heavy armor, or the set battle lines that the Romans relied on. Instead, the Picts used a form of warfare that exploited the terrain of their homeland, guerrilla tactics. They were experts at ambush, moving silently through the forests and mountains, striking when and where the Romans least expected it, and then disappearing into the landscape before the Romans could retaliate. For the Romans, this was a kind of warfare they were ill-equipped to handle. The Roman soldiers, trained for pitched battles and direct confrontations, found themselves at a distinct disadvantage in this kind of conflict. They were heavily armored, weighed down by their shields, swords, and other equipment. The Picts, in contrast, were light, mobile, and agile. They could strike at Roman supply caravans, isolate small groups of soldiers, and vanish into the wilderness, all while remaining invisible to the Romans. For the first time in their military careers, the Roman soldiers realized that their vaunted discipline and superior training were no longer enough to guarantee success. They were now fighting an enemy who used the very land against them. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the Roman legions began to feel the full weight of their isolation. They were far from the support of their homeland, and their supply lines were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The food stores that had once seemed plentiful were now dwindling. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to a steady diet of grain, meat, and wine, found themselves foraging for whatever they could find. The land, however, offered little in terms of sustenance. The forests, though filled with life, were not kind to those unaccustomed to them. The Romans, used to fertile farmlands and orderly markets, were now confronted with the harsh realities of survival in a hostile land. Their rations, already low, began to run out. The Roman soldiers, in their search for food, turned to whatever they could find: wild plants, berries, even the occasional animal. But these meager offerings were insufficient to sustain the army for long. The soldiers grew weaker, their once pristine armor now rusting and their weapons dull from disuse. In the wet, cold conditions of the highlands, the Roman soldiers began to suffer from illnesses that had never plagued them in their more temperate homelands. The cold dampness seeped into their bones, causing joint pain and making every movement more laborious. The soldiers who had once stood tall and proud now trudged forward, dragging their feet, exhausted and demoralized. Amidst all of this, the Picts continued their attacks. They would strike in the dead of night, cutting through the Roman camps like shadows, leaving only chaos and confusion in their wake. They would take out small groups of soldiers, cut down sentries, and then retreat back into the forests before the Romans could even mount a defense. These attacks were designed not for outright victory, but for attrition. The Picts knew that they could not win a direct battle against the Romans, but they could bleed them slowly, weaken them until they had no choice but to turn back. The Roman commanders, once confident in their ability to control the situation, now found themselves trapped. They had underestimated the Picts, believing them to be a disorganized, ragtag force that could be easily defeated by Roman discipline and military superiority. But as the Picts' attacks grew more coordinated and relentless, the Roman generals were forced to reconsider their approach. The familiar tactics that had once brought them victory in so many campaigns were no longer effective. The Roman soldiers had learned to fear the night, for they knew that the Picts could strike at any moment. The legionnaires, who had once been proud of their discipline and unity, now began to question their commanders. Rumors started to circulate within the ranks, rumors of poor decisions made by their leaders, of commanders who were too eager to prove their worth to the emperor and who had pushed the legions too far, too fast. Some soldiers began to whisper that their commanders had led them into a trap, that they had been set up to fail. The soldiers who had once followed orders without question now started to feel a growing sense of betrayal. They had trusted their commanders, but now, in the depths of the wilderness, that trust was beginning to erode.